the greatest art thief really changed for the better the way I experience a work of art. I sort of wish Breitweiser had never become a criminal and could have become an art professor.
I'm Michael Tamblin, CEO of Rakuten Kobo. This is Kobo in Conversation. My guest is the journalist Michael Finkel, author of True Story, Murder, Memoir, Mea Culpa, and The Stranger in the Woods, an extraordinary story of the last true hermit, as well as numerous articles about extreme places and unlikely people for Sports Illustrated, National Geographic, GQ, and the New York Times Magazine. His latest book, The Art Thief, is the story of a man whose theft of over 200 artworks from the sleepy museums of Central Europe shows a singular obsession for possessing works of art that grab his attention and the talent to bring them home. Michael, welcome to Kobo.
Thank you, Michael.
When did you first hear about the subject of The Art Thief, Stefan Breitwieser?
When I'm looking for a subject for a book, sometimes I feel like I'm my own news show, and I like to sit on my laptop and read small town papers. Where isn't that where all the weird stuff happens in the world? It's like I think I've just given away one secret to all you budding journalists out there. But I lived in Bozeman, Montana for a while, a relatively small town. I'm talking to you from Park City, Utah, a relatively small town. I'm telling you, weird stuff happens in smallish towns. And I speak French, and I was reading the French Alsatian newspaper in the northeastern corner of France, and I came across a story about an art thief, and it was just a short piece, and every single fact was more mind-boggling than the next verse. 200 crimes, 300 works of art, an estimated total of $2 billion, but none of that was really what caught me. That interesting as it is, he stole the artwork during the daylight hours with guards and sometimes tourists in the room, all curious. But then the coup de grace, the final bit of this little article said, and he just took all these artworks and hung them on the walls of his bedroom. And I'm like, and that was it, period, final sentence, next weird article from the small town. And I'm like, I must know more. Is that not journalistic catnip or what?
We usually think of art theft being, I don't know, difficult. How did he make this look so easy?
So I think if I asked your listeners to say, imagine an art thief. I think you got two categories. One, you got the fictitious art thieves. They're always wearing a tuxedo and doing some sort of Thomas Crown affair or Dr. No. They're these sophisticated aesthetes.
There
Now,
are lasers, there are helicopters involved, somebody's rappelling somewhere.
oh, there's always a rappel. Yeah, you got right through. There's a skylight always, isn't there? Yes, lasers and skylights. Now, those are wonderful images, and they are completely fictitious. I spent a lot of time talking to inspectors and investigators that specialize in art crimes, and none of those Dr. No's or Thomas Crowns really exist. They're only in the realm of fiction. And then the other one is tell me about a real art thief. And maybe here in North America, someone might say the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston in 1990, $500 million worth of paintings stolen, and none of them ever found. Well, those guys broke in the night, attacked the night guards, bound them with duct tape, handcuffed them to pipes in the basement, then went to the most beautiful artwork in the museum of Rembrandt's and took a knife and stuck it in the canvas and roughly ripped this painting off the wall. In other words, basically destroying the paintings. They were thugs. They had no appreciation for art. They wanted money. They were as if they were carjacking, no difference. And that was a real art thieves. And Breitwieser is neither of those. And that's another reason why he almost is in the realm of fiction, someone who really, truly cared about art. But this is the type of art thief that is an outlier among outliers.
His trial was a public event, and Breitwieser published a memoir of his own. It was understood that he didn't talk to reporters. And so many people looking at this would say, okay, this story is done. What made you believe that there was another book in there?
So the first thing I want to say is that sometimes when I talk about this, people are like, oh, what century are you talking about? Now, Stefan Breitwieser was born in 1971. He is alive. I don't see. I know. I'm not sure if I can say he's alive and well, but certainly he's alive and willing to talk. He did most of his crimes in the late 90s and early 2000s. His last trial for art crime was in 2023, which is literally last year. So this is a modern story. You're right. In France and some parts of Western Europe, Breitweiser is relatively well known. He wrote, I think you said he wrote an autobiography. Yeah, he had a ghostwriter write this hagiography talking
Okay.
about what an amazing person he is. There was even a French journalist named Vincent Noce who wrote a book about him too, almost the opposite, saying, what kind of a terrible, horrible person he is. And I kind of had this idea that nobody really wrote about the real Stefan Breitweiser. And as you mentioned to me, he had never talked to an American journalist before. Hadn't spoken to any journalists when I got in touch with him in more than half a dozen years. But I did feel that what actually happened hadn't been told. There maybe was a bookend on one side lionizing the guy, and there was a book on the other side, making him seem like the most horrible person. And by the way, but neither of those books are available in English. So an entire English speaking audience was left out. And so I guess the only thing I could say is there was just some sort of journalistic twitchiness in the tips of my fingers. And I was like, I really would like to know more. I mean, a book that I like to write is generally speaking a book that I would almost prefer to read, avoid all the effort of writing it and just be able to take it off and read it. But that book was not available. And so I thought, I'm going to see if I could fill in this gap and really write what happened.
It's safe to say he is in many ways an unlikely art thief. He lives with his mother. He steals, but he never sells. The way he steals is almost improvisational.
I love that word.
There aren't diagrams and maps. This is not a heist with repelling gear. Is he reasonably unique in the history of art theft for all of those reasons?
By the way, I did love your use of the word improvisational. Almost when you used it, I was like, I got to go back and edit like a line in my book. So, Michael, thank you.
Happy to help.
It almost has this jazzy sort of feel. So, basically, Stefan Breitweiser, born in the Alsace region of France, which is sort of where France, Germany, and Switzerland all come together. He specialized in stealing from mostly small town museums, which are a little less guarded than the major museums like the Louvre. He never stole from the Louvre, but he did also steal from some larger museums. This pace that he stole from, you mentioned during the day, it almost defies belief. For about 9 years, he averaged one art theft every 12 days. And this is like incredible because you think about an art thief, even a simple crime has to, you think about months of planning and all these detail work. It's such a complicated crime. You not only have to get into a museum, you have to be able to pick the locks or figure out how to get the museum, the artwork out of its display. Then you have to get it back out of the museum, and then you have to get it home and not get caught. And it's not like you're stealing, some sort of like an iPhone where there's that million of them. Like each artwork is unique and so highly traceable. So all these complications. Really make it so that very few thieves, real thieves in all of history steal from that many museums. It's just such a difficult crime. If you really want to go for money, as Stefan Breitweiser himself told me, there are a lot easier ways to make money than stealing art, even illegal ways. So, well, I think I spent the entire pandemic, Michael, doing nothing but reading about art crime. I was wondering just the question you asked me, where does Breitweiser, and I anglicize his name to Breitweiser, Breitweiser, you can say, but
Mhm.
let's keep it like Budweiser, Breitweiser. It's sort of, he himself sort of didn't mind with my big, thick American accent to calling him Breitweiser. Where does he stack up on the pantheon of criminals? And I also should say that Breitweiser himself really loved to read about the history of art crime. So I'm reading and reading. There are almost no criminals or gangs of criminals. Now, outside of wartime, certainly during World War II
Mhm.
and armies, let's just put armies aside. But there are really in the history of museums, and museums started opening up in the mid 1700s during the Age of Enlightenment. So this is a 300-year history of museums. Very few thieves have stolen from as many as a dozen different museums. Breitweiser, who was assisted, I don't think we even mentioned this, by his girlfriend, whom he
Mhm.
lived with, Well, I'm sure we'll get into her. Her name is Anne
Mhm.
Catherine Kleinklaus. That's the other person you need to know. Stefan Breitweiser, the art thief, Anne Catherine, his girlfriend. They made this a team of two, started when they were barely 20 years old, very young. Very few thieves stole from more than a dozen museums. Anne Catherine and Stefan Breitweiser stole from more than 200 museums. So to answer your question in a long-winded fashion, not only is he unique in the annals of history. I don't even think we could give a second most prolific art thief. You have to jump down. I mean, he stands alone as such an outlier among outliers. And again, not just for the number of thefts, for the way he stole and his motivations, which were, we can discuss this as he told me, purely aesthetic and not financial. And so I really have to put Breitweiser in his own category of criminal. That is not to lionize him. I'm not quite sure how I feel about him, or I am sure that I'm not sure how I feel about him.
Mhm.
But but he the really are no, it's not like, oh, here's the dozen thieves that are just like him. He's really a category of one, or he and his girlfriend are a gang of one.
You try to give us a sense of what drives him, his childhood, his family. Uh, Brightwizard's mother seems to be a large part of shaping his sense of self and morality. How much, how much did you know about her um, before you really started to get into this? And were you able to, yeah, to interview her directly or engage with her to try and fill in some of the blanks around him?
So briefly, Brightweiser was an only child. Um, when he was a teenager, his parents had a fairly contentious divorce. His father, who had come from a fairly wealthy family, had this wonderful collection of ivory sculptures, paintings, antique weapons, old watches, and even as a young boy, Breitweiser loved all of these old objects. In fact, as Stefan Breitweiser, the art thief, told me in person, I feel like I was born in the wrong century. He really loved these old things, as many collectors do. After the divorce, his father, who had inherited all these things, took everything, all of his collection out of the house. And Breitweiser was left with nothing. The mother and Breitweiser cut off contact with his father, moved in with his mother, and they moved into this small house. And horror upon horrors, the house was no longer decorated with um, old 18th, 17th, 16th century furniture and paintings, but now IKEA, which to Breitweiser was like torture among tortures. Imagine living with IKEA, which of course, if you look around my house, you will know exactly what it's like. In fact, there's still
And
little
mine too. Yeah.
stickers. Yeah, you find like little stickers A, C, D every once in a while. You find anyway. I mean, that's not my favorite, but Breitweiser, I spent more than 10 years working on the research for this project. Highly inefficient. I don't recommend anyone spend that much time, but obsession has its own. While Breitweiser was obsessed with stealing art, I might have become slightly obsessed with learning how Breitweiser stole all that art. Yeah, so we got to the level of trust where he gave me signed written permission to see his psychology reports. And I read no fewer than five of them. And while all these psychologists had different ideas about what the heck is wrong with this man, they all said something similar, which was quite startling, which is they truly believed that he stole because he loved these works of art, not to gain any financial reward, but to surround himself with beauty. And I find that to be quite fascinating. Again, we talked earlier that this is a motivation that exists among almost no art thieves. And
Mhm.
so when Breitweiser, who eventually gave me more than 40 hours of individual personal interviews, so I actually got to talk to the art thief himself. And I do want to stress that everything I'm telling you is as true as it could possibly be because of course I didn't just believe Breitweiser. I went and talked to all the police officers that hunted him, got all the
Mhm.
police reports, uh, it, interrogations, court transcripts, all these things to try and verify Breitweiser's story. And if there was any sort of contradiction, I would go back to both the police and the art thief himself and try and resolve these contradictions. So there's three characters you need to know. Breitweiser himself, we mentioned his girlfriend, Anne-Catherine Kleinklaus, and his mother. When I say that Breitweiser hung all of the artwork in his bedroom, I didn't mention that his bedroom was in his mother's house. Yes. So the world's greatest art thief was also an unemployed freeloader living with his mom. I think the joke is living in his mom's basement. Well, this was just living in his mom's attic. Same idea. Literally, there was this tiny, modest IKEA decorated house in the suburbs of a blue collar city in France, Mulhouse, and up in the attic of this house is like $2 billion worth of art. Now,
Now, to be fair, it's in two rooms, so it is
oh,
a
okay.
billion dollars a room.
Oh, good point. Yes, this low ceilinged attic.
Mm.
Now, the mother, her name is Marie Stengel. I was unable to speak with. Boy, I would have loved to because the relationship between mother and son seems fascinating. Um, she had given plenty of testimony and also had been interrogated under oath by the police, and I was able to access all of these very essential recordings. So I know what was, at least what she said under oath. The mother has never, in all the 25 years that this story sort of has unfolded, spoken one word to the media. And that is to her credit because she certainly lied under oath. Um, and I do know for a fact that I wouldn't have talked to Stefan Breitweiser, the art thief himself, if it wasn't for the mother. My very first letter to Stefan Breitweiser, I included the French version of one of my previous books. And I actually asked Stefan, did you read that book? And he said, more importantly, my mother read the French book. And she said to me offhandedly, if you ever do want to talk to a journalist, I kind of like this guy. And so I thank you, Breitweiser's mother. She basically said she gave her son permission, and the mother-son relationship is fascinating. Breitweiser and his mother. I think we could keep peeling layers of that onion off till time to the end of time and not get to the bottom of it. But
Mhm.
really, the mother pulls the strings in the relationship and did say talk to this journalist. So in a weird way, the mother's participation in the project allowed it to happen.
I want to go back a bit and pull one thread from what you were talking about, which was the the amount of time that you've spent in correspondence with Stefan. Like um, this is a project more than 10 years in the making from that first letter. Can you talk a bit about how that exchange of information evolved over time to the point where first you thought, okay, there's enough here that I can turn this into a book, but more, what do you talk about for 11 years?
I mean, haven't you seen how gabby I am already? So yes, I read, as I mentioned, I read that small town newspaper article, was like, mind blown in my office. Decided this is the way I like to get in touch with someone. Isn't a phone call a little bit of, does a phone call ever come at the right time? No, it never does, especially when you're talking about, 8-hour time changes. An email, delete, you know, the way I like to get in touch with someone is a letter, and not just a letter. I like to pick out a pen and paper. I don't even know if my children know these things. Stamps, envelopes, they still exist. Like, I really like to send a handwritten letter. It says it's personal. One does not receive a handwritten letters very often, so it sort of stands out. And I also don't want someone to think, oh, my personal address. So I mentioned that hagiography written about Breitweiser. So my first contact was a handwritten letter, including one of my books in French, sent to the Breitweiser's publishing company, asking them to forward it to his address. So very much the most gentle approach possible. You read a letter when you are free. It's not, doesn't even have your home address on it. I didn't find your phone number. Not that I couldn't find anyone's home address and phone number in about 3 minutes of internet searching, but it feels gentle. And then I waited and waited. And I think it took about, I'm really not that patient of a person. Do not confuse me for a patient person, please. But every once in a while, the circumstances require patience. And also, please, listeners, I was working on other stuff at the same time. I have wife, 3 children, and 2 French bulldogs. There's income needed. This wasn't the only thing I
You're
worked
you're not just
on.
throwing a message in a bottle and then sitting at the end of the dock.
Oh,
Okay.
by the way, Michael, beautiful imagery because it does sort of feel that way. Like it actually, dang, I gotta go. Now I gotta edit my book a second time. Thanks, man. No, it is. It actually. That is actually, I'm going to steal that image. That is a beautiful way to say it. It does feel like putting a message in a bottle, really. Like you send it out, like, is the publishing company just going to throw this out? Is this actually going to get forward? Like, you don't want to like check up on it, but you wait. And 2 years later, I was living in Bozeman, Montana at the time. A little note, metaphorically in another bottle, floats by and comes to my mailbox, and it says, "I'm Stefan. Got your message. What do you want to know?" And that started a decade-long relationship. I actually, in that 2 years between sending out the first message in the bottle and receiving Brightweiser's return, moved with my wife and my three children to France. This had nothing to do with Stefan Breitweiser, the art thief, but I had always been curious and I wanted my children to learn another language. I myself wanted to learn French. And so we were living in France. The person who was collecting my mail in Montana got that message, which went all the way across the Atlantic, resent it back to France. If you're thinking inefficient, we're on the same team here, people. And finally got back to me. And for, oh my God, just saying this to you, it's just like, I can't believe the inefficiencies. For 4 years, we sent little messages back and forth, getting gradually more familiar with each other. And finally, 4 years into this ridiculous thing, I said, "Hey, let's meet for lunch. I'm living in France now. Mon français est assez bien. My French is okay." And he agreed to meet me for lunch, but being a pain in the butt that he is, he's like, "No pen, no paper, no tape recorder. Let's just meet for lunch." And we did. And perhaps he found, maybe he thought my funny American accent was un peu charmant, was a little charming. But for whatever reason, after that lunch, maybe it was his mom in his ear saying, "You know what? If you're going to talk to any journalist, talk to this guy." He said, "Okay, let's do some interviews." And from there, things really took off. Yes, we sat in my hotel room and did formal interviews. And you asked how I can spend 40 hours with someone. Well, he did more than 200 crimes, and to just go over each one itself is like a week's worth of chatting. He had an
Mhm.
amazing memory for his crimes, almost like ridiculously photographic. Like, not only would he tell me like, he would be thinking about a crime from 15, 18 years in the past. He wouldn't just tell me exactly how he stole it. He could remember all the other artworks in the gallery from which he stole. And I would go to that museum and I'd be like, "Oh my gosh, he was right. Maybe he got two of them switched." Anyway, our relationship progressed up to the point where he agreed to even visit museums with me from which he stole and go through his crime step by step. Maybe we'll talk about this later, but I can tell you in my
Mhm.
30 years of journalism, I don't know if I've had a more bizarre feeling than walking into a museum with basically the world's greatest art thief and thinking, what am I gonna do if this guy, is suddenly stashes a work of art? But it was like, so I really do. If you're getting the impression that I like my job, sometimes it has the most wonderful, like mind-bending moments, literally going to museum with an art thief.
And as you mentioned before, there is the other person in all of these thefts and in Breitweiser's life, his girlfriend, Anne-Catherine. And she's a character who changes in sudden and surprising ways through the course of this story. Can you paint a bit of a picture of her?
Right. So as I've mentioned to you before, this isn't based on a true story. This isn't like, fictionalized version. This is nonfiction in its most rigid form, meaning if I didn't know that it was true, I didn't put it in the book.
Mhm.
I wasn't able to speak with Anne-Catherine Kleinkaus, Breitweiser's girlfriend. They met each other when they were 20 years old. And while the relationship between the two of them was probably, I spoke to many people who knew them, unhealthy, terrible, toxic, all these things. The one thing that everyone who spoke to me about the relationship said, and it's probably the most powerful thing, is that they really loved each other. And for those of us who have been in love, you can do crazy things for love, not just for love of another person, and then also love of beauty. And Breitweiser basically, I mean, didn't basically, he told me like the things that he found most beautiful in all the world was his girlfriend, Anne Catherine Kleinklaus, and the artworks that he stole. And the two of them lived together in this two-room attic chamber. And it was to Breitweiser like he had invented his own Eden, his own paradise on Earth. And this is a person who was prone to depression, obviously has psychological issues. And he made, like, you could call it his happy place, but of course, to make his happy place, oh, he only had to steal from 200 museums. So Anne Catherine is fascinating. One other thing you should know about her, like Breitweiser's mother, she was extremely smart, probably not to talk to a journalist, not to give too much away, but clearly their crime spree comes to an end. They are caught by the police. We'll leave it at that for the
Mhm.
moment. But Anne Catherine, and one other little wrinkle, with the support, her boyfriend sort of, Breitweiser, the art thief, sort of sacrifices himself to save his girlfriend. She says, "Oh, I mean, I literally have home videos of her like lounging in her bed, saying, welcome to the kingdom. How much are we going to steal this year?" But these home videos were not unearthed until after their trial. And so I'm literally privy to stuff that some of the detectives were not able to find. And so Anne Catherine gets away with almost all the crimes. This isn't giving too much away. She says, "Oh, I never participated in the crimes. I didn't even know my boyfriend was an art thief. Those things on the walls were just, well, they were just stuff bought at, yard sales and at flea markets." And Breitweiser said, yeah, she didn't know. And basically, they run another con, another scam to rescue her. And Breitweiser's the one who gets most of the prison time. And smartly, Anne Catherine, getting away with basically one of the largest art crime sprees in all of history, has retreated into silence and has never spoken to a journalist. But she does play a part in the book.
The trials of Breitweiser in Switzerland and France open up these two really interesting windows. One is a window to an obsessive who has an elaborate justification for why he has to steal and why it's okay. It's contrasted with and pressed up against this other one, which is the role of museums and the tightrope that they have to walk between protection and preservation on one hand and making things available to the public on the other. And I thought that was the trial was an amazing way to illuminate these two conflicting motivations that just sort of collide into each other.
You're totally right, Michael, about museums. And I hadn't really thought this because 99.99% of us don't steal stuff from museums. But I mean, who doesn't walk through a museum? Like my wife and I love to walk through museums together, and always we'll find something beautiful and she'll tap me on the shoulder and we'll look at this and she'll be like, "Wouldn't that look great over this couch?" And I'm like, "Man, that would look fantastic." And we haha, and we walk on to the next thing like everybody else. Like who doesn't have that little fantasy in their head? And Breitweiser, of course, had that fantasy, but rather than brushing it off his shoulder, ran with it, literally and figuratively. He liked to tell me, again, I went to several museums with him. He said to me, this was his great line, museums, Mike, are just prisons for art. And of course, that sounds absurd. But as with a lot of things, Breitweiser told me, it's not entirely incorrect. I don't think Leonardo da Vinci, when he was painting the Mona Lisa, said, "I know the best way to see this beautiful painting. It's with 700 of your best friends just all elbowing yourself around so you can maybe see like the half of back of someone's head and a little bit of my painting and their selfie sticks everywhere." No, that is not a way to absorb a work of art. The way to absorb a work of art is to commune with it, maybe just by yourself. Wouldn't it be nice to sit in a sofa with a nice glass of wine, maybe a little music in the background, quiet? Now, you name me a museum that offers that, and I'll go there. They don't. And as you hinted before, a museum wants you as much as possible to be able to absorb a work of art in a way that feels unencumbered by security apparatus. And there is this sort of push and pull, this tug of war between protecting the works of art and allowing you to commune in front of it. And again, it's difficult. If you could put bars in front of almost all paintings, and you probably have no more art theft, but then of course you'd have bars in front of paintings. And so this is one of the topics that is touched upon in the book. Like, how can a museum, an institution whose goal is to bring you to a work of art, how can they also protect it? Breitweiser would say they failed entirely. I would say, they've done, there's room for improvement, but this is the best we can do. Anyway, these questions are relatively open-ended. And again, I feel like you, the readers, listeners, absorbers of the work can decide, where where on the scale you are, like Breitweiser's culpability and again, museums' responsibility. And fortunately, really, they do depend on public trust more than you might imagine, especially smaller town museums.
There is that moment in the book, and it's in about, I think, the ninth chapter, where there's a passage that is striking because you do break that spell that you've been casting up until that point of journalistic objectivity, and I'm laying out the facts and I'm giving you the story. And then you do say, he is a cancer on the public good of museums. And you've been giving this very objective third person telling up until this point, and then you kind of draw a line across it and go, no, actually, this is terrible. You shouldn't be that way. Did did you struggle to find the right way to signal your judgment to the reader, or even to withhold it entirely? Like when do you decide to lean in and say, hey, actually, this is kind of terrible?
I think I don't know what other writers say, but let me just be honest with you, Michael. I don't really know what I'm doing. I mean, I've been a journalist for 30 years, but anybody who's interpreting like, oh, this was the way this book had to be written is I mean, thank you for thinking that. But the truth is when I'm writing, I don't know if you go to a concert, I sometimes like to hang out by the soundboard because I'm fascinated by it, and there's like a million little dials. And when I'm writing, I sometimes feel like I'm at a soundboard. There's just a million little dials, like lead into put myself here, take myself out here. And I'm trying my hardest to give you, first of all, number one, we got to stick with nonfiction. We got to stick with the facts. But number two, I just want you to enjoy the book as much as possible. And so I'm spinning these little dials. And did I get them all right? I'm not sure. But eventually, when it came to Breitweiser, and I really do, I can't say the word enjoy, but I am attracted to talking to intelligent criminals. And I can't even explain why, but it's just something. I mean, I love the heroes of the world, the freedom fighters and the emergency room doctors and nurses. Like those are amazing people. But I sort of look at them like they're like stars in the sky, like sort of untouchable and amazing. And really, I guess my people are the criminals. There's just something about a criminal
We
mind that
all
fascinates.
love a heist.
We love a heist. But eventually, criminals in general, since I've spoken with many of them and done many jailhouse interviews, they love to have excuses and reasons and twisted rationale. And eventually, you do get to the point where, as I think you implied, my reporterly, remove crumbles, and I'm like, I'm calling BS. And with Breitweiser, first he calls museums prisons for art. And I'm like, that's a little extreme, but I get it. And then he says, this is my favorite. He says to me, you know, I don't want to be called an art thief. And I'm like, yeah, dude, you're the most prolific art thief of all time. Now, he didn't deny any single one of his crimes. In fact, to be honest, he was proud of them. He definitely didn't shy away from them. But then I did say, what would you like to be called, Stefan? And he said, oh, I would like to be called a collector with an unorthodox acquisition style. Now, did I laugh? Heck yes. But did I? I mean, eventually one can only be pummeled with so many excuses. And then, of course, you have to say, no, you really, Stefan, you are the opposite of that. You are really a cancer on the public good. And let's just call it what it is. So, Michael, if you're calling me out on like eventually my journalistic, lack of, my journalistic remove crumbles. Yes, I am also a human. I admit it. There's a human behind every piece of writing.
Well, and the reason that I call it out is because as I'm living with Breitweiser through this book, I can't help but find him irritating, annoying. He's self-involved. He is
It
not a
is.
great boyfriend. And so there is a point where you're sort of waiting to say, like, are you going to call him on this at some point, or do I have to just scream into the dark while I'm reading this and do it myself? And so there was almost a like a relief to it, a catharsis to it. I was like, okay, I'm not alone in thinking that there's some problems here. But as irritating as Brightweiser can be as a character, from the start, you establish like, he is a pretty good art critic, and you include early on some of his analysis of the ivory Adam and Eve sculpture that he's stolen to show just how creatively he is able to look at great works. How did your feelings about him change and evolve over the course of writing the book?
Okay, my fellow readers, it is true that the main character of the art thief is kind of a difficult to like person. Now that doesn't mean he's not fascinating. But one other thing that, Michael, that you just touched on is that whether I like Brightweiser or not, and really most of the time I was I didn't like him. But besides all the crimes and all that and all of the inanity surrounding Brightweiser's life, the simple fact of the matter is that he changed. Brightweiser, the greatest art thief, really changed for the better the way I experience the work of art. I sort of wish Brightweiser had never become a criminal and could have become an art professor. You know how we walk through a museum and like the first thing you do is you get the professor voice in your head where you're all like, look at the paint strokes, look at the symbolism, look at the balance of pose and all these crazy things. Brightweiser would, whenever I started doing that, which is sort of a weirdly natural thing. I don't know why that happens, but maybe I'm just trying to prove. And again, one of my favorite things is sometimes I'll go with someone, with a friend, or I'm actually thinking in my head, am I supposed to like this? And Brightweiser, whenever I said all these things, we're like, what do you mean supposed to like it? This is not a quiz. This is art. Like, am I supposed to like, the mountains or the beach? Like, if you like them, you like them. If you don't, it comes from inside. So anyway, Brightweiser would always tell me this little like, it's almost like a slap on the wrist, like emotions first, Mike. And the way Brightweiser himself walked through a museum is he would like fast, like, no, 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 not me, not me. And then he would stop in front of something that called to him, and we would spend a long time there. And he would talk to me about what he liked about it. And it always started with his emotions. And so if anybody who's listening here and they go to a museum the next time, let's take the advice of the world's greatest art thief and feel free to tell the person you're going with to the museum, let's go look at this like an art thief, except for the stealing part, which is
Mhm.
emotions first. For example, if you're in front of one of those like famous Venus paintings, Birth of Venus, a woman usually coming out of a beautiful seashell, and you start talking about symbolism and stuff, let's just stop for a moment. Venus is beautiful. She's unclothed. There's going to be boobies there. You're going to feel a frisson, if that's what attracts you, of sensuality. And rather than trying to avoid this under layers of intellectualization, stop. Do you know that feeling? You're just getting a little frisson coming through yourself. You're attracted to someone. Go with that. Lean into that. You might even get little goosebumps on your skin. This is why that artist painted that. You're supposed to feel that attraction. That is way deeper than looking for symbolism. You can do all that later. But if you approach, this seems crazily simple, but I believe, I'll just talk about myself. I was not doing this in museums. Heart first, emotions first, be horrified in front of a painting of war and go with that. Like there's gore and there's blood. Feel weirdly transported if you're a religious person in front of a religious painting and sit with that feeling of beatificity or transport. And then of course feel free to feel sexually attracted or turned on in front of a painting that's supposed to turn you on. And these will make your museum visit, not only will it enrich it, it might almost totally transform it. I went to enough museums with the greatest art thief that it changed the way I sort of interact with works of art for the better. So the whole crazy yarn of the story aside, I believe that tucked into the edges of the book is sort of this secret way to re-establish your relation with works of art. And I'm not talking about just paintings and sculptures and other objects in museums. It really extended to music and natural beauty and attraction to another person. And it kind of gave me like a little a bump in the way my appreciation of aesthetics. And I sort of wish that Breitweiser had just become a teacher. He would have been the greatest museum tour guide or art professor that I've ever encountered. But that's, of course, not what he chose to do.
And and your description of that, as much as the writing in the book, helped to answer a central question for me about the art thief, Stefan, which was, was he a magpie in the sense of like, was he attracted to shiny objects and just couldn't keep his hands off them? Or was he a person who had those emotional responses to work dialed up so high that it was something that he had to move on, that he had to live with those works. And I'm wondering where you land in your assessment of him as someone who clearly lined a nest with $2 billion worth of art, but the driving impulse behind that.
I mean, I think what you just framed as his mother and his girlfriend and the other assorted like secondary characters like his grandparents, and he also became friends with this framer in a frame shop. Like they all thought that Breitweiser was this special person, this aesthete, and there was nobody that was telling him, dude, you are not able to steal this stuff. You have to you quit it, act like an adult. They thought he was this special case. So is Breitweiser this special aesthete, or is he really just freaking incorrigible, unstoppable criminal who's just sort of coming up with this fluffy excuse to really as a way to sort of keep on stealing? And I don't have an answer for that. And the fact that you asked that question is that really like every reader or listener of this book can answer it in their own way on that scale, from complete like special case aesthete to complete cancer on society, and nobody is wrong. I will tell you that myself, as well as both of the police officers that were essential in hunting him down, and his therapists, and the people that were friends with him, and myself, all agree. There is no question that Breitweiser was deeply aesthetically attracted to these works of art. Now, he is also an incorrigible thief. Briefly, there's a fascinating psychological disorder called Stendhal syndrome, which is not in the official DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. So it's not an official diagnosis, but it is like sort of this unofficial and well-known thing. Stendhal, after the French writer Stendhal, who went into a church in Florence in the 1800s, saw this fresco on the ceiling, felt so overwhelmed that he felt dizzy and like his heart was like racing, and he had to run outside of this basilica after he saw this fresco to recover on a bench. Like he thought he was going to pass out. It was so beautiful. It might have just been that he tipped his head back too far. But anyway, after this, a head of the psychology department at the main hospital in Florence, she noticed that there were a lot of other tourists who seemed overwhelmed at times in front of art, and she came up with this diagnosis called Stendhal syndrome. You don't have to know much about it, but the fact is, in everything in life, there is a array of reactions. Some people will go to an opera and be like, wow, I was bored. And some people will go to an opera and be like, I was transported. It was heaven on earth. And so what I'm basically trying to say is that in every sort of stimula, every sort of form of art, there is a wide range of human reactions. Some people fall in love with this particular person. Other people do not find this other person attractive. That is normal. And there's definitely a volume switch. There are some people that are highly sensitive to beauty, and there's some people that are low sensitivity. And I think it would be fair to say that there's no way that Breitweiser faked this forever. I went to museums with him. I saw what happened to him in front of a work of art. Now, was he acting the whole time? And if you believe that it was just complete fake out, that's totally legitimate. But I'm telling you, this was a person who was highly sensitive to things that he found beautiful. And I actually found that reaction itself was sort of beautiful itself. That feeling of being carried away by something that's beautiful, music, art, theater, natural beauty, another person. This is what makes life worth living. It's not like working at your job and getting your paycheck. It's being transported by something beautiful. And as a writer and as an absorber, my whole life of things that are beautiful, I mean, I was enticed by Breitweiser's aesthetic sensibilities and disgusted by his crimes, and all those things together, I had to work out over this 10 years.
Your approach to The Art Thief began as a series of letters that spanned years. And this isn't a new approach for you. With your book, True Story, it started with a letter that you wrote to the murderer, Christian Longo, who tried to kind of steal your identity during his run from the law. And then that turned into over 1,000 pages of letters back and forth. When you heard about Christopher Knight, who had lived in the woods of Maine without speaking to anyone for 10,000 days, who became the subject of your book, Stranger in the Woods, you approached him by writing a letter. So my question really is, how many more of these like message in a bottle letters are floating around out there waiting for the response that becomes the next book?
Well, more than one. Let's just say that way. Yeah, I mean, I'm giving away my style, but not the exact people. Yeah, I mean, did I say before that I don't know what I'm doing? I'm going to repeat it. Like, I mean, you're people, you're listening to kind of a spoiled brat. I have been a journalist for 30 years without any specialty in anything. Like, whatever, I am so fortunate that whatever fires up my journalistic spidey senses, for lack of a better thing, I'm able to pursue. And literally, it's been like theoretical physics to psychopathic murderers. I'm so blessed. I mean, I have no boundaries besides what makes me interested. And some outlier human beings, whether they're, you know, in criminality or in scientific breakthrough, fascinate me. And I do believe, as I touched on earlier, without repeating it, that the softest way to contact someone is by a handwritten letter. And so, yep. And that image of floating bottles, Michael, is not going to leave me after this conversation, because it's so pretty that I'm sending more. Yeah, there are several bottles floating. I'm always looking for more work. I'm so pleased that those people who do respond, I believe that, for lack of a better phrase, it was meant to be.
Amazing. Mike, thank you so much for joining us.
What a fun conversation. Thanks for having me on.
I've been speaking with Michael Finkel, the author of The Art Thief, a true story of love, crime, and a dangerous obsession. Find it and all of the books that we've spoken of at Kobo and Conversation's home on the web, kobo.com/conversation. Check the show notes for a link. Subscribe in your podcast player to catch every episode. And if you enjoyed this one, tell someone whose attic is stuffed with precious books that they've either purchased or lawfully borrowed from a library, because they are exactly the kind of person that we would like to know. Kobo in Conversation is produced by Nathan Maharaj and hosted by me, Michael Tamlin. Thank you for listening.